Welcome to the Global Discussions with creatives, leaders, and thinkers. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Dr. Lollie Mancey. You're very welcome to the podcast. Let's begin by asking you to introduce yourself. Tell us all about your world and all the fascinating areas that you're involved in. So over to you, Dr. Lollie.
Thank you very much. Lollie's fine. I'm an anthropologist, and I'm an anthropologist who finds myself in the last 5 years working in innovation and entrepreneurship, but also in moving now further and further into the digital world. So in terms of what an anthropologist does, they look at the changing culture. And I've built a couple of businesses based on sort of ritualized culture in Ireland, addressing, I suppose, how we're moving away from being church going and how we redefine our rituals. So I have a celebrancy business, a wedding business, a funeral business, a few others. So on top of all the ritual stuff, I found myself kind of being more and more involved with the idea of our changing culture in terms of Ireland specifically becoming more, the sort of a hub for sort of the tech companies. And I started looking at how that's impacting us in terms of where we think we're going, but also how we're adjusting to that and what the impact of some of that is. And we can see a big impact of that at the moment with some of the layoffs, of course. So I'm right at the intersection. I work in UCD in the Innovation Academy, and I'm the course and program director for the graduate certificate in creativity, entrepreneurship, and innovation. I'm also the course director for a new course that we've just started in January, which is completely unique in the world, which is digital transformation, technology, and resilience. So I've been working all winter on getting that put together.
So the university life is certainly keeping you busy, Lollie. That's great to hear.
Yeah,
You're
I love my
definitely in the
work.
right place because we love talking to leaders, thinkers, and creatives here, and you tick all three boxes. Um, I know you've also got some background in radio.
Yeah.
You do an awful lot in terms of public speaking, professional speaking. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about that intersection, because you've kind of got the educational side. You also are, in your own right, a radio presenter. You're a keynote speaker. How do you fit all that in? How does all that come together for you?
I have more hours in the day than most people. I figure. Well, the radio show came out of keynote speaking, so that was an absolute blessing. I'd kind of put it on a mental inspirational board of what would I like to be doing in the next couple of years, and then COVID hit. And so I was asked to do a keynote speech for a group called the sort of women in transport and aviation and technology. And I was doing a fair bit in terms of people feeling very disillusioned and disenfranchised when we first had COVID as to what's happening to my industry. And one of my ex-students actually was the one that put me onto it. And what I realized was the travel sector didn't need somebody coming in with all this toxic positivity going, oh, it'll last a couple of weeks. Remember those days? Be a minute and it'll all be over. It'll all be fine. I thought what they probably needed was just somebody to talk about, if this does go on, what it'll feel like and what we can probably do, in terms of losing everything and our entire foundation income and everything else being trapped in that. So I did a sort of no BS approach to what was going on, and it was very well received. And I also talked about how it's a very positive thing to have multiple revenue streams in terms of entrepreneurship. You may have one day job, which I do, but I also have businesses as well. And that means that if one of them goes, I'm not going to, suddenly drop off the face of a cliff. I'm going to be probably all right to scrabble myself back up again. And so I talked about what that might look like and how they might take this time of no work and sort of the mental turmoil and actually, do some online courses. And one of them was ours, which is a Springboard course. So it's funded by the government. And it wasn't really a promotion for the course, but it was just to say, if you've ever had a business idea or you've thought about trying on the sort of mindset of an entrepreneur, there is this course. It's available to you. You can come on this course. And we can sort of try and see if we can work out a business for you as a sort of a side hustle, perhaps. And then maybe your day job's coming back, but maybe it's not. So that's sort of where it started. Somebody watching that went out on YouTube, got in touch with me that was on the board of a Dublin South FM radio show and said, have you thought about radio? And I said, I've thought about a podcast, so radio would be lovely. And they said, we can give it to you in the format of a radio show twice a month, but also you can have it as a podcast. So it just happened. It just emerged. I manifested it. It's called An Entrepreneur Like You, and it's on Spotify.
That's wonderful. Thanks for sharing that. I want to ask you a question then. So it's great that we have you here because, you know, as an academic, as a lecturer, as somebody involved in university, and you mentioned a couple of the sort of areas that you're involved in there, but I particularly want to dive into this digital transformation and this entrepreneurial side of the discussion because, you know, the world's gone through this global pandemic. Everything changed upside down. Social media, the use of smart devices, smartphones is growing at a tremendous pace. Most of the world, you know, most of the developed world is connected to the internet in some way. And it's changing our behaviors. It's changing the future of work. It's changing the way businesses operate. And I'd love to get some of your insights into the upsides, the downsides, the opportunities, and the chaos that is about to ensue. So where are you at with all this as somebody that sort of lectures on this very topic?
I think the chaos is already here in a number of different ways, but let's not forget also, we're talking about 50% of the world roughly at the moment. It's the rest are in what we call digital darkness, you know, and it's coming. But of course we've got infrastructure to work on in terms of that. So I suppose on one hand, the democratization of technology where we all have access to it. And there's a lot of talk at the moment about data mining and big data and ethics around who's having our data. You know, and so that's really important because at the moment we're giving away a psychological insight to ourselves every time we press on any sort of form of social media. So what they're doing is profiling us through our own choices and then giving it back to us. So what I've designed recently and been working on the last year or so is this idea of how do we go from passive to active with all of this stuff, because we can't turn the tide. It's done. We're in it, you know. Actually, the internet was born back in 1969, but it took a while sort of to come to fruition. So it's not that we can suddenly move away from it, but I think we need to understand what's going on in our brains. So I used anthropology and sort of neuroscience to design a course recently and ongoing. I've got some more coming as well in this same vein, where it helps us understand what's actually happening inside of our brains every time that we're clicking or swiping. So we're getting a dopamine hit every time we get a random reward. So the reward could be a like, could be something we're interested in, could be an Instagram reel that we like the music of, and our brain is highlighting with a little dopamine reward that makes us feel happy. What happens after we get the reward is our brains are then going into this form of sort of almost stasis where we're scrolling, but we're now in a sort of a form of what I could equate to be like OCD, where we're seeking out the next reward, but that's what doom scrolling comes from. It's the idea of we're just randomly on there. So there's another thing that occurs with all of that, which is sort of time blindness, where, you know, it's a fact that we actually don't know how long we've been on something. So I use a number of different sort of apps. Like, for example, there's one on Instagram that says to me, you've been on Instagram for 30 minutes. And I'm like, it never feels like 30 minutes. Unbelievable. And it says, would you like to close? I'm like, oh, sometimes I override it, you know, and just think, well, that's an hour. But if we go back to the, you know, the sort of the Industrial Revolution and sort of, you know, we're now in a different type of revolution, a technological revolution. A lot of the stuff that was there to save time, right? And in technology, you know, in terms of sort of washing machines and sort of, you know, other things that were developed at the time. So my old granny would have been mangling and scrubbing, you know, scrubbing her washing. Then the washing machine came out in sort of the 50s to 60s, and that was to save us time. Well, technology is the same. It's everything saving us time, right? But what are we doing with the extra time is the big question. So if we're using that extra time to go back into the technology to waste an hour or whatever it is or more, you know, in terms of your app usage, we're not actually saving it. So we have to be aware of what's happening in our brains and sort of actively use it is the first thing. The other thing also is, you know how, because I'm involved in end of life in terms of some of my funeral work, and people would say, oh, my biggest regret is I spent too much time at work, you know, and I got to the end of my life and I wish I'd spent more time with my kids. You know, none of us are going to say, I wish I'd spent more time on Instagram, you know, and how shocking will it be, not would it be, to realize how many years we've actually been just passively sitting on these apps, you know, in terms of what we could be doing. So I'm looking at that at the moment with great interest. I'm also looking at some of the idea of sort of technology for the sake of technology. A lot of companies are like, here's the next shiny thing, let's all learn it and use it. And rather than, what we do in the Innovation Academy is we use design thinking, which is a process where we look at the customer first, so we don't even go in with a question. What we say is, what is the user's experience in this? No company is asking their staff for feedback in real time about these technological apparatus. They're just saying, we've made an overarching decision that this is for the good. Where most employees that I talk to are suffering technological burnout, where they're just going, it's just one more thing all the time. And then my students today were talking to me about a project they've been working on, which is looking at the research of do we actually need, coming out of COVID especially, one more sort of, a social moment within our workforce. The old water cooler thing where we used to meet at the water cooler and in the corridor and have a chat. Now people are going, okay, so we're going to have a Friday night thing on Slack, and people are going, I just want to switch off. I just want to go for a walk. We can't keep adding technology into the mix saying it's all good and we need to be on Zoom, 8 to 10 hours a day or whatever it is. It's not working out. So there's a lot of burnout, a lot of issues with the way that we're relating to things. Even sitting here on Zoom, it's using a completely different part of your brain and your energy levels, So the doomsday scenario is we'll all end up like that little character in Wall-E with the tiny little legs and the sort of, we're stuck in our chairs for the whole time and we've got big eyes and we'll grow bigger thumbs, in terms of scrolling. But I think we're nowhere near any of that. And so I'm trying to look at it from a sort of egalitarian perspective to say, who's making the decisions in technology? Is it all young white male tech startups, and who else is filtering into that narrative and that conversation? And how can we be active in the choices that we make about the way technology is going? And who is it serving, So there's a really interesting discussions going on at the moment, both in the Innovation Academy and my students and much broader as to sort of, what are we actually doing here, and just taking a breath for a minute before we just upload another load of apps for the good.
That's fascinating the way you've approached that. Thanks very much for sharing that. It springs to mind, you mentioned the people living in digital darkness, and that's something that we often forget about. I think that's such an important point that you raised at the very start. But also the fact that technology is supposed to help us, and yet it feels quite often that it's not. And the thing that you said there, which is how many years of your life have you spent on these platforms, it suddenly made me panic and go, I wonder what that statistic is for me, because it would be scary, I'm sure. But a lot of these apps, platforms, technologies were designed by quite limited groups with not much diversity, with one of the parameters was to keep people, I'm going to use the word addiction, it may not be the best word, but to keep people on for as long as possible. And, that's obviously having an impact in terms of humanity, culture, the way we act, the way we react to things. And as you say, it's taken up a lot of the spare mental capacity, whether it's doom scrolling or whatever, that maybe could be applied to other endeavors, other creative thinking, or other things that are maybe helping us as an individual or helping the wider
I think when you use public transport, for example, and you see everybody's, including me, like sitting looking at their phones, that used to be a time potentially where you may be reading a book, or you may be looking out of the window, or, so once a month I take the dart out and I just sit and look out the window and just think, I'm about the only person on this dart doing this, like kind of everyone else is looking down and introspectively down some sort of tunnel, in the tech world. Apart from perhaps the very, the much older, who aren't engaging with technology in the same kind of way. So what we're doing is when we're filling all of our time with this content, we're actually stopping ourselves being bored, firstly, and we're stopping ourselves daydreaming. But out of boredom and daydreaming comes creativity, comes thoughts, comes, I could have, this could have happened, or that could have happened, and sort of the more dreamy stuff. So I would now be out on my bicycle most days, where, you know, in all weathers, because I actually find there's something about my personality and the way that my brain works very well. When I'm moving my body kinetically and the legs are turning, it's actually making my brain think about things in other ways. And I can't be on my phone because I'm cycling, holding the handlebars. I may be listening to a podcast or an audiobook, but I'm trying to do that less. You know, so I'm trying to give myself the space for my brain to think wider, or even just to relax, you know, just to see the swans on the canal, or, you know, the traffic.
That's a little bit about what makes us human. And
right.
I think you said something else really, really insightful there, because unless you reflect on things or think about things, it's almost as though you're not processing anything. You're not actually living in the moment. It's just coming at you constantly, and you just, I'm going to use the term scrolling again. I know it's not a great description,
We're
but
depleted by it. Yeah, we're either flourishing or it's depleting us, you know, in some way. So what, for each of us, what flourishing feels like and looks like will be different. You know, but if you're feeling exhausted when you're waking up, you know, I would say have a look at what you're doing the hour before you're going to sleep. You know, so there's a lovely like work looking at the brain in terms of, so you know how people go, I'm going on a digital detox and I'm going to put my phone down or away for the weekend. I'm going to have a whole 2 days without my phone. And people go, oh, I feel so refreshed when they come back. Pair that with, I can't find my phone in the house. And what your brain is telling you, it's like you've literally lost a piece of your body, you know, an extension. People won't be able to contact me, and the fear arises, this idea of we have to stay connected at all times, you know. Yes, being socially connected extends our life. All of the research shows us that, you know, the key to longevity is actually to be socially connected in some way. Now, for some generations, and I think Gen Z probably more, they've used that incredibly well during COVID in terms of staying connected through things like Snapchat and other things, you know, where they're connected to a large number of people and they don't feel alone. And that's absolutely brilliant. But that can't take the place of actual physical connection or sort of social connection either. It's got to be alongside of it. But on the other hand, there's research that's showing that for introvert personalities, you know, these technological platforms are a godsend, because not everyone is an extrovert and is comfortable. So there's some really interesting stuff happening with people with introverted personalities who are getting together, sitting in a room and either reading a book or using technology. So they're together, but separate. And actually, that's the same in some autistic communities with the people that are neurodivergent. They're finding ways to kind of be connected physically together, but sort of separate, that fits with the way that their brains are operating. It's fascinating.
yeah, I like that. Thanks for sharing that. That's really good to hear. And yeah, I think that there is I don't know what the size of it is, but there is a proportion of people during the pandemic, assuming, you know, putting aside the tragedy and the loss of life, but just from, you know, introverts, for example, I know quite a lot of people who really thrived through the pandemic. It was one of the best working experiences they've ever had. They and do not want to go
I'd
back
almost
to
say in
the old
hushed
way.
tones, I enjoyed it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's interesting because everybody's different. Yet I know lots of extroverts too who couldn't wait to get back to in-person events, couldn't wait to fly again, etc. So it is different for everybody. Yeah, yeah. I wanted to ask you a question, if I can, just to change direction a little bit. Is I like for our guests to share a little bit about their own style of learning and how they onboard information, whether it's reading for pleasure or whether it's listening to that audio book while you're cycling that you mentioned. What kind of things do you read? Do you watch? Do you work better in, you know, those real life conversations? Do you listen to a lot of podcasts? Is there a particular genre or author? How does that work for you?
Mainly audiobook, in all honesty, because I'd like to get out and about. So one of the positives from COVID was sort of the amount of steps that we were all doing, and I found that incredibly beneficial for sort of mental health, and physical, of course, you know. So I do probably walk an hour and a half every day, and if I'm not with my daughter walking and talking, then what I'll do is I'll plug into something that's interesting, usually themed around my current obsession, which will change as we move forward. At the moment, my current obsession is the idea of what authenticity means and bringing your full self into work or into various aspects of your life, and whether that's wanted, a good thing, how that's defined. So I'm working on a keynote speech at the minute around that, around the idea of of what it means to be authentic. So I think a lot of the time we need to question, these things that we just see all the time, the word resilience or authenticity or imposter syndrome. What do they actually mean, and where are the parameters for all of them? So I'm always looking at that sort of intersection between current buzzwords and sort of an industry, I suppose, and sort of how people are interpreting it. So I get a little bit hooked up on those kind of things. I am neurodivergent myself, so that's where some of my energy comes from. But then also I can't read a book anymore. So in my PhD years, I did. I read an awful lot of journal articles, a lot of books, but my brain just won't let me slow for that now. So as for whatever reasons, it works better, in an auditory way. And again, I'm speaking a lot because I'm teaching most mornings online. So I don't really have the capacity, once I've sat down for sort of 4 or 5 hours on Zoom, to stay sitting and relax. I then need to get up and start moving, because we didn't evolve to be sedentary. And that's part of the issue. It's why people have got, walking desks now and other things, because there's a lot of research showing us that actually it's very detrimental to be sitting even 3 or 4 hours. We really do need to be moving. And that's, both the mental and the physical benefits. So, yeah, so I'm not much of a reader, unfortunately, anymore, although I do have a lot of books.
Yeah, but I suppose the audio book and I think the moving is a really important part. As you say, it's part of who we are as a species. I think it's ingrained in us. And
I love the way, sorry to interrupt you, I love the way as well that it's in the voice of the author very often. I think in terms of, the anthropologist inside of me, I want to hear that person speak their words. I don't want to hear what I think their voice is saying, because their nuance could be different. And touching on that as well, I'm obsessed with podcasts. So at the moment, one of my favorites is Stephen Bartlett, The Diary of a CEO. And not necessarily just because he's talking to entrepreneurs, but his methods, his sort of style of it's very empathetic. He really listens, and he's very insightful. And I do believe him to be a great guy. He just sort of seems to have a lot of sort of love for what he's doing. He seems quite genuine, in terms of that. So I really admire him using his platform in order to give people, more space. But we're seeing this a lot now, which is fantastic. Other podcasts like The Happy Place, people talking about where they've come from in their life. And I think an awful lot of people are getting supported through listening to other people's ideas of failure, people's ideas of, it isn't this lovely, shiny, filtered life. Life is tough. It's really tough. And there's a lot of undulations, and it can really knock you for 6. And I've had a fair few of them myself, so for other people to sort of talk about the humanity and all of that, we're making good strides in mental health and helping people connect to us to sort of say, me too, it's awful, isn't it? Or I had that, so I think there's sort of COVID's given us the accessibility where more people are being vulnerable, and vulnerable in a way that sort of, isn't linked to shame, as Brené Brown would sort of talk about, in a way that sort of vulnerability is now becoming applauded. I think that's brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think that vulnerability, it sort of lets people in a little bit to the real you, doesn't it? And I think people really respond well to that. And you've also mentioned neurodiversity a few times, and I think not in a huge way, but I do see that businesses, for example, are starting to understand the importance of topics like neurodiversity, and they are starting to maybe educate themselves, if I could be so bold, in terms of the importance of accepting people and working with people, and that everybody's different. And particularly when it comes to that, I know the word authenticity gets overused a lot, but showing up as who you actually are, I think is really important, because a lot of people, particularly as you go back a few generations, have lived a life that they possibly didn't want to live, or have chosen a career that they possibly didn't want to choose. And
right.
It is refreshing to see change coming that way. And maybe the pandemic, one of the silver linings of a terrible tragedy, is a more openness, hopefully.
I agree with that. I mean, and I think it's we're not, it was only in the 80s that we had homosexuality criminalized. I mean, let's remember where we've come from for a minute. We've made great strides in Ireland. We're a fabulous little Ireland, and we've got very modern very quickly, in the big scheme of things in terms of our sort of heritage. But also, it's not bandwagon jumping, to say that, probably, well, it's hard to put a figure on it. I think it's somewhere around 70% of all the entrepreneurs I've ever met would be neurodivergent in some way, the founders. And so this kind of whole shrouded secret of, people say, how do you have all these crazy, wonderful ideas? Well, it's a superpower that some of us have. And actually, you'll find there's a lot of people in similar roles in that, and so it's not even sort of, learning to adapt. It's a bit like the same-sex referendum was won on the fact that we all know gay people. So, what are we saying here? Like, kind of, we're all together in this. Let's stop being so, divisive, and actually just say we're more similar than we are different. And actually, in an evolutionary perspective, that is 100% true. We are certainly more similar than we are different. So the learning styles and the difference is the exciting part of it. The more diverse we are, the more creative we will be. So, and I can prove that because in my teams in UCD, when the students come in and they're studying, we'll put them very quickly into random teams. And those random teams will always produce something incredibly creative over the fact that if I'd picked an artist and an engineer and, and somebody for each role, they would play safe a lot more. But the random nature of who you're getting means you're actually getting pure innovation, So we've even trialed it where we've had there's 6 teams, instead of working on 6 different projects, all working on one project, and all 6 are incredibly different. So the more diversity you have, the better. And so, we've got to sort of break out of this idea of sort of difference and just sort of say, how do you operate? So one of the things I'm looking at the moment is sort of saying to people, well, I operate very well on WhatsApp, but never call me and WhatsApp me a message, but actually I prefer a voice note, and so that's, people know my style and what I prefer, and I'll get back to them with a voice note, but I won't ever answer the phone to them because I'm off doing something else, or I don't really like the interruption. Somebody else might like to be emailed. So if we actually knew each other's styles, just on a very basic level, we'd be communicating more effectively with each other. So I think it just goes back to that conversation of how does it work best for you? And, and just sort of seeing that all of us have our own superpowers, and we flourish under certain conditions. And how can we flourish better, more prosper?
Yeah, I love that. Superpowers, and how does it work best for you? I think we would achieve an awful lot more, for sure.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, though, because we touched on sort of whether it's marriages or funerals or the Institute of Celebrants or, your radio show, your podcast, your lecturing, at the university. There must be people that you've admired that have inspired you along the way, or it could be right back into your childhood. But when I ask you that question, is it a particular personality, character trait? Or is there actually people that you say, do you know what? These people really have inspired me along the way.
I like rebels. I do. I have to say, I like people that say, okay, that's the rules, but whatever, that do it their own way. I like people that march to the beat of their own drum, I suppose is what I'm saying. I've met it'd be sort of remiss of me to sort of start naming people because I've met incredible people, all the way through my life. But I think that those people that are kind of kind, but also that would have a social conscience. I'm the kind of entrepreneur that sort of needs a bit of a passion project in things. And so, part of what I'm doing in the celebrancy sector is, helping people facilitate ceremonies for their communities. And I would meet an awful lot of passionate people that want to actually help celebrate life in whatever form it is, at all stages of their life. But I really admire people. I met Harry Crosby recently. I'll give him a name shout. And I met him in a cafe in Baggot Street and talked him into coming to speak to my students for their alumni party at Christmas. And he was saying to me, well, I never finished the Leaving Cert, so how am I successful? And I said, well, you can't take success as education. Like none of us do, you know, and there's more than one path, you know, there's just, he's always seems to stay true to who he is, you know, in terms of, yes, he's a character, but he's now working on some amazing projects to give back to the people of Dublin. And I just think that's brilliant, you know. So, you know, I was listening to a podcast this morning, right? And it was about the science of awe, as in AWE, awe and wonder. And what they were saying was the research is showing them that the higher up in class or socioeconomic status we go, the less empathetic towards others we become, the more detached we come from actual real world suffering, you know. And I was aligning that in my mind to the happiness index, which is an index that talks about, you know, with when you reach a certain amount of money and your basic needs are covered with, you know, a small amount of luxury, in terms of maybe a holiday a year or something like that, there's an increase up to about 70,000 euros a year. When you hit 70,000, it plateaus. When you reach 90,000, if you will be to be so lucky, your happiness actually starts to decrease with every 10,000 over that. And that's, they showed this over a number of countries. And so if you align those two things, that you're less empathetic potentially because you're more detached from people when you make more money, and the more money you make, the less happy you're going to be. There does kind of seem to me to be a really distinct correlation there with when we get to a certain point that we can afford to live the way that we want to live, and we're supporting, you know, those that are dependent upon us, we really have to be giving back. What else is the point of it, you know? And so you know, even if you're saying it's for my happiness, you know, so the other thing that is talked about in terms of longevity and sort of the psychological well-being of ourselves is that if we are in service, and then we are happy, you know, this idea of sort of giving back to others. So the businesses that I create are around helping other people do that. And then that is enough for me because I'm helping them give back and I'm giving to them. So it's sort of this chain, I think. And there's also, you know, some fantastic work, you know, being done with sort of these idea of random acts of kindness where people are just kind, but don't altruistically, you know, like paying it forward, people putting money into a cafe and someone comes in and gets a free coffee, or just these very small little tweaks to human flourishing, to, you know, remember, you know, there for the grace of God go I, you know, I've been very lucky in my life and I've worked very hard, but I've also been incredibly lucky. So at the same time, I think it will be remiss of us not to look at the bigger picture, you know, especially at the moment, you know, and always keep one eye on the fact that if I can help, I should, you know, for all sorts of kind of reasons. Yeah.
I love that. And, you know, whether it's paying for a coffee for somebody else, or whether it's paying for the person behind you in the fast food car takeaway section, or whether it's, you know, some very high net worth individuals or very globally well-known wealthy people, you do find quite a number of them turning more and more to philanthropy as they get older, as they start to realize that giving back is really important. So whether it's on a small scale or an extremely large scale, I suppose measured in money, which sometimes isn't the best measurement, but that giving back and that helping others, it really does connect with us as humans, doesn't it?
And it doesn't have to be money. Very often it could be time, you know, or just hearing somebody or just asking somebody if they're okay, you know. I think we sort of seem to be under the impression that society is fixed and static and we're just sort of going through the motions a lot of the time, but actually it's evolving, you know, it's moving all of the time, and it's up to us to actually shape it, you know. And I don't mean that sort of, you know, we are able to make changes. You know, I'm a huge fan of protesting and saying when things are wrong. And I do think the individual can make massive changes. You know, I mean, I look at somebody like Vicky Phelan, you know, we really can make enormous changes. But I think if we sort of see our lives as this sort of, you know, each day is a new one. What am I doing today, you know, can I do something for somebody else, you know? And in that kind of case, if we all adopted that sort of mentality, we would really be flourishing and we would, you know, be improving our lot for each other. We're moving much more now into a collective way of thinking over the individualism that sort of came from the early 80s. I can tell you a couple of business ideas that are to do with that, if we've time. So, we had a car hire crisis last summer in Ireland, and people were paying, €5,000 for car hire for a week. It was complete madness because they'd sold off a lot of their stock during the summer, during COVID times. A company called Turo is coming into Ireland. It's coming through Europe at the moment. They've just bought WeCar, we as in we in French, OUI. And they've come out of San Francisco looking at the idea of car sharing. And the problem that they're solving is, can we move people with cars to this kind of collective ideology? And the answer they've come up with is yes, and they've got a genius solution. So very shortly, you'll be able to hire. So if you have a car, I'll be able to hire your car, and I'll be able to take it from you. I'll pay you for the hire of your car, and Turo will cover any insurance needs. So you're making money from your car. I don't have to buy a car. I can share your car, and I can bring it back to you completely perfect. And you won't have needed it. So it's a win for you. It's a win for the planet, and it's a win for Turo. But it's also about that sort of collective mindset. We have to start thinking that we are an organism altogether, rather than we are loads of individuals separated from each other.
I like that a lot. Yeah, maybe it will help with
it's coming. So it's a God help hurts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's quite a lot of people in Dublin City looking forward to that immediately. The other thing I want to ask you, though, because we talked a little bit about, the type of things, and I like the giving back, and I can see that rebellious streak in there a little bit again that you touched on earlier. But what about advice? There must be advice that you've picked up along the way that has really stuck with you, that you think is really important, that you've held on to, that's helped you in your life? Or is there some advice that you'd like to share with our worldwide audience that you think is so important in this life?
I think in terms of entrepreneurialism, my favorite saying at the moment would be fail fast, which is, if you've got an idea, get in there, see if it's going to work quickly, and don't put your life savings into it. And then if it doesn't work, move on. There's no shame in that. In fact, there's only learning. We don't really have a culture in Ireland of sort of being able to embrace failure. And I think we need to. For example, in the States, unless you've had a couple of failed businesses, you're nobody. Nobody's going to trust you. So here we kind of like, oh, it didn't work. It's the end of, it's the end of everything. Absolutely not. So there's all sorts of nights being set up around the world that are actually where people share their failures, and I just love it. There's even a failure museum now that's on tour around the States where people share all the failed innovations, which is really good. So I think just sort of, again, moving away from the shame and sort of leaving yourself a bit vulnerable and saying, that didn't work. Oh, well, give it a go. What else could work? So that's really important. And then I suppose the second one would be to steal from Oscar Wilde, be you, everyone else is taken. I think I only know that now in my 50s, the idea of you're unique, and there's only one of you that thinks exactly like you do with your life experiences. And we hide ourselves a lot. We've got this sort of personal, this professional persona. We've got our sort of persona with our friends and family. And again, goes back to this idea of authenticity, just turn up as yourself, see what happens, that's it.
Yeah, be you. I think that's great advice.
Yeah.
And as you look forward at this time of recording now, we sort of have quite a year ahead of us. What are you hoping to achieve over the next 3, 6, 12 months? How does the planning process work for you? What are you hoping to achieve as you go forward this year?
Well, I'll definitely get all my students to the finishing post by May. So that's the first thing. So I have 3 courses running from January until May. So they'll all be finished. So that's great. On top of that, also, I'm working on a new endeavor. So it's a social enterprise that is kind of a non-school school. So it's looking at how we can help people learn about entrepreneurialism, learn about business, learn about money, but for people that absolutely hate the format of traditional schools. So I'm looking at the moment, and the neurodivergence will come into that, of course, but not just that, people that actually feel that the system sort of failed them, and they feel, that, and it'll be a free course as well. That's really important to me in terms of sort of equality. But I'm looking at the moment in sort of, can we teach through hologram and all sorts of amazing things, as well. So a more sort of a more playful approach, but lots of really important information. One of the things that happens to you when you're an entrepreneur is other entrepreneurs, and all of the knowledge that we have is kind of all kept. And what I want to do is blow the lid on all of that and say, let's open source it and let's just get loads more people helping themselves, because this shouldn't be privileged information and it shouldn't be who you know. It should be available to anybody at any time in their life. And again, it goes back to this idea of making it accessible to help others. Not everyone can come into UCD. So the next thing for me in my private life, or my business life privately outside of the university, will be trying to sort of make things more accessible. And I'll work on that all year and roll it out at the beginning of next year, I think.
That sounds very exciting. And it's a topic I could talk at length about, but the education system as it is today, it's a little bit like the way we work or were working pre-pandemic.
Right.
It's kind of built from a different time. And I really like what you're saying there. So I will watch that very, very keenly. And I think opening it up as well and making it more available, because a lot of people, you mentioned entrepreneurs earlier that are maybe neurodivergent, and a lot of entrepreneurs, some of the most successful entrepreneurs in the world, didn't even finish school or dropped out of college.
Didn't serve
and so
them.
people learn differently. And I think there's lots of ways of learning today. I'm not talking down the education system. I'm just saying it doesn't apply to everybody. And, people who have a gap maybe in some of the knowledge that they don't have access to, whether that's financially or just they're not aware of it. I think the more we can do to open up education for everybody, the better. So I will watch that very closely. That sounds very exciting. One of the
controversial aspects to the way I'm thinking at the moment is, if you think about people that, coming from a disadvantaged area, myself, I'm originally working class from London, from the west of London, from a council estate there. And I think about the kind of people that I was around that showed me what business looked like would have been drug dealers. In all honesty, they're the ones that understood supply and demand and everything else. So if you could open up a world where there were a number of other opportunities, in terms of the things that you're learning, I think, you're really sort of expanding. And it goes back to this thing of who's innovating and who's making businesses. It can't just be people that are privileged through education, and it can't just be people that get a lucky break. It's got to be people that are supported. So we would have probably 80% of entrepreneurs in Ireland are male, 20% female. Some of the accelerators like Dog Patch Labs would have that number up to about 46% at the minute, which is really good, but they are outliers. If it goes down to people of color, you're looking at 2%, especially if it's women in Ireland at the moment. So, as we become more diverse and more multicultural, we have to support not only people from all socioeconomic status, but we also have to support that diversity. So a lot of the VCs, the venture capitalists, are only funding sort of med tech or the big shiny unicorns, So I really want to sort of redress that in some way. And I'm talking to a lot of people about how do we help the people that have so much potential, but they just don't know where to go to get that first step on the ladder. So I want to design that and then maybe bring in some funders, see what happens. I want to level the playing field. That's basically what I'm saying. Yeah.
I love it. Love it. That's fantastic. Some of those statistics are staggering, by the way.
Well, and they're improvements. Yeah.
Yeah, more work to do here, I think. But
yeah,
I think we've got the right person targeting it. So I think I think we've got you in place now. I think things will start to change. But look, is there anything else before we run out of time today? Is there anything else that you would like to maybe share with our audience? Anything else I haven't touched on that you'd just like to shine a light on? And also, if people want to find out more about your the new project that you're working on, or the radio show or the podcast, or get in touch with you, where's the best place to send people to?
LinkedIn at the moment. So I'm Dr. Lollie on LinkedIn, Lollie, Lollie, not with a Y. I'm very happy to connect to anybody. My show's called An Entrepreneur Like You, so it can be found on all podcast platforms. And what I do with that is I try to find entrepreneurs that are unusual. So they're the unexpected entrepreneurs. And because it's 80% male, 20% female, I have 80% female and 20% male in terms of flipping it over. I got an amazing guy coming on this month. It'll go out in March, which is a guy who was a banker, and he now owns 100 alpaca, and he's got 50 revenue streams coming from his alpaca, and he lives this beautiful life in Wicklow. So I find these amazing people and hear their stories. Yeah, I'm really happy to connect to anyone. And I think just really the advice I would say is that there's more than one way to live your life. You know, it's up to you. And listen, it's the words of the poet Mary Oliver. What will you do with your one wild and precious life? You know, we weren't designed to be sitting online doing jobs that we hate, you know, and very often we are. There's very low job satisfaction at the moment, and people don't know what to do with it. There's sort of this whole idea of sort of people engaging just at the minimum at the moment to get through their work. There's a lot of burnout, especially in the tech industries, you know, from the way that they're being worked. Some form, you know, in some ways it's kind of almost Orwellian. We look at things like Amazon and people can't take toilet breaks. Even tech workers are telling me the same thing. They're getting tracked through their irises in terms of their computer systems to check they're actually not checking other emails and all sorts of horrible draconian things. So, you know, if you are in something that you hate, have a think, is there a skill set that you've got that is unique to you that you can teach? Is there something that you can have in terms of, can you upload something to some kind of teaching platform that's going to help other people? Can you get some kind of passive income? The big win really is when I see my students take what they think are very random parts of their life and sort of combine them, almost like a squiggle career. You know, they say, oh, I don't have this linear trajectory of something. And I'm like, it's the best thing to have. Because when you've got a squiggle career, you've got a foot in loads of different areas. Is there anything you could do to sort of bring that together? So I'll just finish with one last thing. So we had this conundrum with a student of mine who was looking at the retirement industry. He'd been in banking and pensions. He knew a lot about that, but he hated it. It was very boring. And then he'd also seen this really interesting guy in this country who was he was creating snail farms. And so what he decided to do was, I said, put the two things together. So he decided, yeah, I'm going to have a snail farm investment sort of situation. So when you retire, he would teach you how to have a snail farm. And actually, it's very lucrative, strangely enough. So I'm always thinking, find a niche and own it, you know, be the first one to find these two crazy things and put them together, and then find mentors or find a course or the local enterprise office or, you know, one of our courses or Trinity Tangent, or, you know, I'm not competitive with other people. I just think anywhere you can get in is going to help you. So yeah, just reach out to other people. And if anyone wanted to reach out to me, I'd be more than happy.
Well, that's a lovely note to end this episode of the show on. So thank you so much indeed to Dr. Lollie Mancey. It's been a pleasure to have you with me today. And thanks to everybody who's been watching or listening around the world. Make sure you like, follow, subscribe, do all the things you need to do to help us promote and support this podcast. We sure would appreciate it. And I'd also appreciate if you can join me back here for more discussions with creatives, leaders and thinkers. Thank you, Dr. Lollie Mancey. It's been an absolute pleasure to catch up with you again today.
You're very welcome.